Hi, welcome back. In the last video, we examined the question of whether or not people are rational, that is, whether they make choices that are in their best interests. And we determined that for the most part they are, but that they can be tricked. Let's take a look at a few tricks in the family law system, the traditional family law system. There are three problematic principles in the traditional family law system, which are the first trick. When people open a business, they develop what's called a strategic intention. The strategic intention is what the business is trying to accomplish for the customer. If it's a product, what they want the product to do for the customer. If it's a service, what they want the service to provide the customer. They also develop what's called a value proposition. The value proposition is what they want the customer to experience as they go through the entire process, from the very first contact through the process to the end. They also develop standards by which to measure how successful they've been at accomplishing the strategic intention and the value proposition. So what are the standards in the traditional family law system by which they measure the outcomes? They're vague, inconsistent, and sometimes contradictory. What is equitable division? Equitable suggests something close to equals, fairness, but what's fair? And what does best interests of the child mean? Parents could argue forever about what outcome is best for their children. In addition to these three problematic principles, we've identified using game theory principles what we call the top 10 tricks. These are ways that the legal system tricks people into making irrational choices that are self-defeating in the long run. The first trick is that it focuses on legal outcomes rather than long-term goals. The legal outcomes on the day of the judgment of divorce are identified as the goal. It's the goal for the attorneys, not life goals of the parties. Divorce is treated as a zero-sum game. Parenting and financial planning are not zero-sum games, but once people get into the legal system, they find them treated as though they're zero-sum games. It assumes a dispute. Even the name of the case is so-and-so versus so-and-so. The other attorney is referred to as opposing counsel. The other attorney and client are termed the other side. Parties who come into a divorce probably with similar or maybe even the same long-term goals find themselves immersed in a system that expects them to be in a dispute with one another. It treats children as property. Children used to be property. That changed in the late 1800s and early 1900s when children became a class of citizens with their own legal protections, with child labor laws and child protection laws. The next trick is that the system promotes selfishness as a strategy. An attorney doesn't ask the client, what do you and what does your spouse want with regard to custody of the children or financial distribution? The attorney asks, what do you want? And then begins to develop a strategy to get you what you want. It promotes that selfishness, even though in the research on game theory we know that the best outcomes are outcomes in which the aim is to improve the value for both parties. The next trick is that winning legal outcomes is the goal. That's the attorney's goal. They want to win legal outcomes. But those legal outcomes might be self-defeating for the parties going through the process. The system promotes anger and blame rather than focusing on the sadness of the divorce. Oftentimes people come to divorce angry and blaming each other for the marriage going sour. The legal system fits right into that, and soon the anger and blame escalate. Deductive decision-making is promoted. Deductive decision-making is making a decision about the big picture and then drilling down to the details. By the time people get to holiday schedules, for example, they're handed templates on alternating the holidays every other year. Deductive bargaining, we know for a fact, produces less than optimal outcomes. The day of the divorce is the end of this relationship is also a trick. It is not the end, although by the time people get the divorce, they sometimes have the illusion that they no longer have a relationship with the other person. And that simply isn't true, and that's especially if they have children. They'll have a relationship for the rest of their lives. And the final trick is that blaming is a good strategy. In fact, I've heard lawyers called professional blamers. And that works in some aspects of law, but it does a lot of damage and tricks people in family law. The traditional family law system essentially turns a planning process, or what should be a planning process, into a competitive struggle. In the next 2 videos, we're going to be taking a look at what parties can prevail at using the game theory bargaining model.